start that. And then I'll figure out how to dig this recording out later. So Jenni, you want to introduce yourself here?
Yeah, I hope I missed the couple of introductory comments from Ben and Rick, so I hope I don't repeat something you both have already heard. But I'm Jenni Dressler. I am a retired corporate attorney, and I have a mediation practice here in Chicago. And I was accepted into the CIIS Psychedelic Assisted Research and Therapy Program as a counseling attorney. I'm also completing a master's degree in pastoral counseling at Loyola University of Chicago, which is where I live. And I hope when I get done that I will combine the use of psilocybin with end-of-life care, not only for people who have a terminal diagnosis, but also for the friends and family and loved ones who are accompanying them on their final journey. So those are my particular interests. I'm also interested in the idea of a psychedelic-assisted dispute resolution, and I'm sort of working through a model in my head what that might look like, and what the legal ramifications of that are, because certainly you wouldn't sign a contract while you're, under the influence of medicine. But those are some of my personal interests.
All right, wonderful. And so, yeah, just in general, what we're here to do tonight is to facilitate a discussion with you all and answer some of your questions as folks that have been through maybe some training in this that maybe other people haven't or have been interested and positioned well within academia to maybe advise students about ways that they can start broaching some of these conversations with their faculty and start maybe like getting involved with this a little bit more at the master's level. And so I've got some questions that folks filled out through the RSVP thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of keep that on the kind of backside and keep what we're doing here a little bit more conversational. And then anything that we don't get to just kind of through our conversational Q&A, we'll come back towards the end and get to at that point. So I guess with that being said, who would maybe like to kind of start us off with a question about like training or ways to maybe start getting engaged in this? And you can kind of, when you come on, just introduce a little bit about yourself and, where you're at in either your own training or practice, or kind of what you're doing for, in this field at the moment. So who would like to maybe kick us off here with a question and get our conversation started? Okay, Rick?
My name's Rick O'Bannon. I'm currently in my master's degree at Adler. I just started the Adlerian Psychedelic Society for the students, kind of to do the roundabout thing, just trying to get everybody together, people that are not only interested in the area of psychedelics, but I'm trying to collect people that also have questions about the safety and the efficacy of psychedelics within the space, because I think it's very important to get ahead of the curve, because the way that I kind of think of psychedelics in the space, it's kind of like a wave that is coming inshore, and it's better to be on top of the wave, riding the wave, than getting crashed right into it. So I'm trying to generate a lot of buzz within my grad school right now, just trying to get faculty members involved as well as students. I guess for me, my big question is probably developing a language for counselors to use. I come from a Jungian background. I always call myself a Jungian in an Adlerian world. But I think transpersonal psychology with Stan Grof, he really has really built a language out, so to speak, to talk about some of these things going forward. And I think it's important that we actually have some sort of dictionary or thesaurus for counselors to use, even if they're not going to be able to be using it inside of their practice. I think it's very important that they at least have some sort of language to communicate to their clients instead of just calling them straight up crazy.
Yeah, I think, Rick, did you want to kind of jump in there first?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific idea. I really hadn't thought of that, but I think, developing a common sort of language to use around this is probably very important. And I think it's important to take a look at a lot of possibilities there. I think one of the problems is and just sort of my personal reaction is that when I just use the term psychedelic, a lot of people tune out really quickly. To sort of put some thought into how can we label this in such a way that's going to allow for or keep people from getting that immediate reaction, negative reaction. Now that you're just using drugs to replace drugs and things like that. So I think that's a great idea. And Rick, I know some people at Adler. I did a consult for them a few years ago. It's a great place. Fred Hanna?
I found nothing but welcoming and open arms within Adler. I've been in talks with a lot of the faculty member, and they're all very welcoming about the whole situation. They're just waiting for safety and efficacy. But my big thing is if you wait too long, you're going to have a bunch of clients that are trying to talk to you about things that they may not have any idea about. And, you know, I really like how Stan Groff has really changed the lingo, so to speak, and using holotropic states instead of just, you know, altered states of consciousness. But, you know, you're right. I mean, using the term psychedelic, even though it may be the most befitting word to use for it, it's still a hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, I like it, but I just find that as soon as it comes out of my mouth, I see sort of a turning off in other people. So I'm looking at different ways. I do like sort of integrating as sort of the idea about consciousness and working with different states of consciousness that feels a little better and gets a little better reaction. But that's just the direction I've gone.
I guess it all just comes down to education. And on a side tangent, I didn't realize the University of Iowa even had that course, because I'm like 20 miles south of Des Moines. So I wish I would have known that.
Rick, I got to tell you, this was like 43 years ago.
Oh.
So I suspect. And the professor I had, Leonard Miller, who was in a constant state of alteration, was in a good way, has been gone and was passed on decades ago. So I really doubt that the course is still there.
I wish it was, but you know,
me too.
We're in the psychedelic renaissance. Maybe that time will come in the near future. You never know.
Yeah, I think you're seeing it with some of the courses that really are labeled more transpersonal counseling. I think the term transpersonal has been a little more accepted. At least I hope so. I've been teaching that for 20 years at William & Mary. People finally started to get used to the term.
Well, and it really comes down to evidence-based practices. I mean, evidence-based practices, and that's always the thing. And really, that's really the hallmark of trying to get this integrated into counseling, is that it has to be accepted by insurance. If it can't be accepted by insurance, and people gloss this over all the time, it's not going to take on mainstream. It's not going to be something that is accepted in a fashion that, say, CBT would, or EMDR, or IFS. I mean, some of the of course, I mean, you could go on and on, because Dr. Dick Schwartz is a big proponent of it. You know, Stanislav Grof, a big proponent of it. And then Vanderkolk, he's also a big proponent of it. So we just need to get more of these people into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll say, I think one of the other things we can begin doing to create some of that formal language, and this is something that I'm starting to see and anticipating is going to be a problem for the field, is the term psychedelic is overly broad. And so when we're speaking about psychedelic assisted therapy, I'm trying to start getting people to encourage that as understanding that as a model in terms of the stages, but not necessarily referring to any of the substances that are being used. And so our language right now is very sloppy, especially as things like ketamine are starting to enter the picture, because that means that we can't anymore talk about psychedelics as this kind of unified group, because there are increasingly a different number of drugs that have different pharmacological properties that are being used in a psychedelic assisted therapy model. And so I think when we're talking about this with folks, it's really important to delineate whether we're talking about classic psychedelics which LSD, DMT, oh geez, my brain's breaking, psilocybin, mescaline, versus MDMA or ketamine or ibogaine, because all of these are different drugs. And so I think really starting to promote some increased nuance around that will also be helpful in the field in establishing it as a credible, kind of approach. So Jenni, did you have any additional thoughts to maybe add to this one? And if not, we could skip on to the next.
Well, as an attorney, I think language is critical to communication and to communicate precisely. So I applaud your efforts at, marshaling resources to define the appropriate language in order for us to talk about this, accurately and thoughtfully.
So Julius, you've got a hand raised in the chat here. If you want to pop in next, just tell us a little bit, quick intro, and then share your question with us.
Hello, everybody. My name is Julius Geldof. I am currently living on the island of Oahu, and I'm in my master's program at Alliant International University and focusing on clinical counseling, but personal focus is on trauma therapy and psychoactive substances. As within my own personal experiences, I've had a great deal of healing that has come from those experiences, even though I never utilized them from any other perspective than healing. And so the question that I have is, there are a whole bunch of facilities or organizations that have quote unquote trainings that they utilize or they facilitate in terms of MAPS. They have psilocybin training where you can actually take a course from them. And while I'm going through my program, I'm kind of curious from your experiences, what is the best route to kind of bridge this gap of, having your master's degree and being licensed in a manner, so to speak, to facilitate these experiences?
Yeah, so I could head that one if folks would kind of like. So this is a very, I think policy is an area that really is going to need a lot of attention to. And so in terms of kind of licensing, and Julius, you said you're kind of in a master's program right now, if I heard correctly. I was also answering a question in the chat. But so if you're in that space and state, in terms of licensing, the way that the FDA is currently approaching this is they are looking at MDMA and psilocybin, and those are going to be available for prescription only in conjunction with psychotherapy. And the FDA has not yet put out their sort of final requirements for the people who are going to be allowed to facilitate those sessions. And Jenni, you also jump in here and correct me if I give any maybe misinformation or out of date information, but my understanding of where the FDA currently sits is that they're going to allow, I think they're going to allow master's level practitioners, but they haven't decided on the level of training that they're going to need yet. So in these therapist dyads, I believe MAPS, in particular, because MAPS has been more unified in pushing this through the FDA than folks doing psilocybin have. And psilocybin, you've got like Compass Pathways and USONA that have been doing this. And so it's a little bit more diffuse in terms of the ways that they're advocating for licensure. And so I believe both of those folks have advocated for master's level practitioners to be able to facilitate. And because this is in therapist dyads, they're also advocating, I believe, for one of the people that is facilitating won't necessarily have to even have a license. So they might be able to be, let's say, if they were a licensed chemical dependency counselor working at like a bachelor's level, or if they have maybe some other backgrounds that would be helpful for this work, those folks might be able to come in as well. Oregon does this a little differently. They have created a whole new state licensing agency and regulatory board. And right now they are in a rulemaking period for, I believe, the next like year and a half or so. They're going to be finalizing the requirements for folks to be licensed in that state to provide psychedelic assisted therapy using psilocybin. And so their requirements are actually, I believe, going to be even less stringent than the FDA's, because they're kind of getting ahead of some of the accessibility issues that are coming along with this. And so those are those drugs. The other component here is the prevalence of ketamine-assisted therapy clinics. And because ketamine is a Schedule III drug that's been used off-label for quite some time, it is the Wild West with who can facilitate those types of sessions, and what requirements and training that you would need to do that. In my own work and doing some of that, I tried to get ahead of the curve and message my licensing board and say, hey, this is something I'm going to be doing. What sorts of training do you feel would be necessary in order for me to do that? And they said, well, you would of course need a prescriber. And so I was doing this under the supervision or in conjunction with an anesthesiologist. And then they also recommended that you would need to have very specific oriented training, and then also be working in supervision while you're providing this. So I think at the federal level, you're going to see in the next couple years the more well-defined requirements for licensing come out. And then you're also likely to see different states take on different requirements as well. California is putting together some bills similar to Oregon's. And I expect at some point we'll see some conflict between states and federal agencies around who can do this. So does that kind of answer your question there, Julius?
No, it does. I have one more question. The compound ayahuasca, has been utilized within religious practices, and there's the whole Santo Daime church that has kind of opened that up within the United States to be utilized within a religious practice. And at the same time, while it is seen in that capacity, from individuals that I have interviewed and discussed these concepts with, they've gone to those facilities and have worked with that substance, and they one of the things that they had said is that the need for some therapeutic intervention was kind of prevalent, or was necessary. And so I'm kind of curious, as that particular compound becomes more publicly known, do you see that as an avenue that people can potentially take in terms of connecting it with the spiritual side of things while integrating psychotherapy into it?
Jenni, do you maybe want to field that a little bit, since you're kind of also approaching this more from a pastoral counseling perspective? I've got some thoughts that I could add after, but you might be a good one for that.
Yeah, Julius, I am doing a pastoral counseling degree, which means we integrate spirituality. It's a straight up counseling program, but we integrate spirituality, through every course we're taking, through every lens we're looking through. And in talking with Bill Richards, who's the lead researcher at Johns Hopkins in the psilocybin studies, he really firmly and strongly believes that an important avenue for expansion is through chaplaincy work in using psychedelics. And he really would like to see more people get involved in the way that you're stating. So I do see that as something that'll be opening up the more spiritual practice of psychedelics, not just your clinical practice. Another interest of mine is ego dissolution and what that means for a person's spiritual growth. And I am working on a paper right now on that. I was talking about it with Ben earlier this week.
Sounds very exciting.
Yeah, so I do see that as an important, and certainly, in the clinical modalities, at end of life practice with psilocybin and existential anxiety, you're going to come up against these spiritual questions. And I do think it's important for people to have some spiritual training, or to be able to refer to somebody who has that background and can address these issues. Because ultimately, I don't think that there's a, at the end of the day, that spirituality and psychology really do connect. And I think you need to have exposure to both to be effective as a clinician and spiritual guide.
Yeah, if I can just sort of jump on that too. Again, coming from sort of mainstream counseling, one of the things I've seen developing at a fairly rapid rate over the last 10 or 15 years is the integration of spirituality courses into counseling programs. And you're seeing some textbooks now coming out of counseling. Craig Cashwell's textbook on spirituality and counseling is in its 3rd edition. Craig's on our faculty here, William and Mary, and a lot of other too. So I think there's a barrier that we've sort of been maybe slowly breaking, in the barrier of when you don't talk about a religion or spirituality in counseling. I think that barrier is pretty much gone now, and I think it's an accepted topic. Whereas again, when I was around 20, 30 years ago, that was just not something that was talked about in counseling master's programs. But you're seeing it happen a whole lot more. So I think there's a nice convergence coming along here, and I think from what Jenni was saying about pastoral counseling programs, and again, there's an ideal integration there, because again, for me, the active ingredient in this is spiritual experiences. So
Yeah,
I think it's a natural combination.
Yeah, I really do appreciate all your guys' input. The one thing that I've kind of been noticing, as within Hawaii, there's a type of culture that exists where people come out here for that spiritual connection, being with the green and nature and everything. And so you'll have these facilities that'll kind of be created, kind of like a mom and pop kind of thing, where they're saying, hey, we're doing an ayahuasca ceremony. And so while they may have a understanding of the spiritual components of it, you do also have people coming in with severe trauma and all of these different things. And I've experienced it and seen it myself, working at Zendo Project within Burning Man for 4 years. And within this space, it's, I see that it's necessary for, at least in my perspective, to have the understanding of that spiritual component, as well as, okay, if something gets into, rumination of thoughts or, severe trauma contemplations, that there has to be that bridging of the two. So very cool.
I think spiritual experience is something that has been left out. And I think that's the reason why we're seeing a mass exodus out of traditional religious organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really goes back to the fact that, the experience of the divine has been kind of taken out of our religion. So you got Brian Malinescu, who's wrote a brilliant book about the Dionysian order and the Eleusinian mysteries with the Kaikion. You could have an entire topic about that. But really what's going on in America is we're trying to gravitate towards some kind of spiritual center. What's kind of neat is you have like the Jewish Entheogenic Society. I mean, they just had their first annual conference this year. Rick Strassman's been a big integral part of that. So it's all trying to find some sort of framework to build off of these kind of spiritual experiences. Mm-hmm. And I think it seems like we're all on the same page when it comes down to it. It's like you really cannot discount the divine when you have these kind of holotropic states.
Well, I think something that's very important that's coming out in the research right now, in the psychedelic research, is that you achieve, and Ben helped me with the language here, but you achieve more healing or more effective healing when the psychedelics occasion a mystical experience.
That's Roland Griffiths. That's a direct quote from Roland Griffiths.
Right.
And I'll put in back our reference to language here again, because that is the case with psilocybin, but not MDMA. And so to kind of cap this question off, I think what we're really getting at is some challenges in professional identity. Because when I see places that are legal ayahuasca churches talking about their ability to treat a mental health disorder, to me, that's a little bit of a conflict of interest if that person does not have the training and background in what our culture says, like, this is how we treat and diagnose mental health disorders. Mm-hmm. And so I do believe there needs to be some sort of mixing and blending there, but I see some challenges, especially as sort of the the religious freedom becomes the loophole through which we start treating mental health disorders. And so I think the notion of professional identity of the people that are working with these compounds is something that we quite haven't really figured out yet. I mean, you know, just in our CPTR program, we have medical doctors, we have nurses, we have clergy, and we have counselors and social workers and psychologists, and we're all gathering around this thing that we're doing. But in some ways, I feel like it's something new, and we see this kind of model in Oregon, where they've just created a whole new mental health profession. And so I think that that question of professional identity is something that we're going to be grappling with in terms of how we are oriented towards these compounds and the work that we're doing with them. Because
certainly this area is ripe for research. So if you're considering doing a PhD, I mean, the field is wide open, you know, for you to make a mark.
Now, playing the devil's advocate about this, though, a lot of these churches within America, when they facilitate these sort of things, they also have licensed practitioners on hand, and unfortunately, we're not tapping these type of people for their experiences or their expertise within the field. I mean, we have an entire gray market in the United States of integration coaches and practitioners that have been facilitating psychedelic assisted psychotherapy since psychedelics were around, but unfortunately they're not going to come to the surface because there's no guarantee of their safety.
Yeah,
it's just the way it is right now.
And so I think really working to understand, you know, in terms of like looking at how this is going to pan out at a level of federal regulation, there are going to be different people that can have different licenses that can work in this field. And I think you're going to get a different approach when you're working with a psychologist doing this versus a pastoral counselor versus somebody that has some, you know, grounding in a more kind of religious setting that is approaching this. And so I think there is some space for some diversity in that, but I also believe that it's important that we each understand sort of our role and know our scope of practice within that. Because, you know, I might know transpersonal psychology, but I'm not going to be a person to talk about, you know, the ins and outs of an ayahuasca ceremony. And so I think that professional identity piece is something that is very much on the table and needs to be more defined and refined as this field kind of progresses. So I think if folks are okay, we might kind of move on to the next one here, and we can always kind of loop back if that comes up again. But no, I see you've got a hand raised here.
Yeah, hey. I'm Noah. I'm a master's student at Eastern Michigan University. I'm a returning student. I live in New Orleans. I'm in New Orleans right now. I've got a bar and an art gallery just down the street. I'm just coming into this. I'm a novice. My question is, what is like the operating space as it exists today? Like, let's say I'm a licensed clinician. I've done the Naropa program. I've done a MAPS program. I've got some sort of, you know, this weird patchwork of accreditation. What am I like? What does it look like at the street level? Am I like, is there like a secret knock to get into the basement of the clinic? Is there a neon sign that says, come on in, we've got mushrooms? Like what is it from a practical standpoint? What does it look like to operate in this space? And I know it's
Move to
different
Colorado and Oregon or
yeah,
California.
I know it's different from state to state, right? So take like two super, oh, this is my dog, by the way, everybody say hi to Slim. So like take like Texas and Massachusetts, like, you know, two polar opposites. What is it like to do this, like at the street level? Maybe Jenni,
I think
you're a lawyer.
Well, that's sort of the threshold issue, right? Is it legal? So, and is it legal means two different things. One,
how do you operate? I know that like you've got the federal, you know, the feds saying no, and then maybe your state saying yes. How do you practically, how do you operate in this space?
Well, practically, you have the question of, are you doing treatment or are you doing harm reduction? Right? Because treatment technically isn't legal, except in Oregon, where it really isn't legal until they finish doing their rules. And then can you do treatment in jurisdictions where it's been decriminalized? So practically speaking, what most people are doing is what they're calling harm reduction. And whether that means they're doing prep work, whether that means they're doing integration work, and whether or not that means they're sitting with people, I can't say. None of which would probably be legal, but harm reduction work certainly is legal.
So like, Ben, how are you providing your patients with mushrooms? Like, how does this work? Like, how?
I'm not. And so those are very clear boundaries that I will draw with people, is that in a preparatory, like, I will not talk with people about how to psychologically prepare for a session, because I'm not going to be present there to help ground them, guide them, call 911 if, shit hits the fan or anything. I can't test the drugs that they're taking. And so what I can do with somebody if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm interested in this and I've got access, what I can do is say, all right, let's talk about ways that, you can make the environment safe. Do you have somebody, that is a trusted, supported friend or, partner that can, be with you during that time to, mitigate that risk? And I can talk with people a little bit about common, possible effects. What I'm not going to do is talk with somebody the day before, the week before their experience and say, all right, let's talk about the trauma that you're wanting to work through in this experience that you're going to go do by yourself at home. And so for me, those are where I sort of draw the boundaries. And then when it comes to integration work, then I can talk with people a little bit about, how they're making sense or making meaning of, their experience. And so this is going to vary, if you have that patchwork that you were mentioning, right now, anybody, and again, this comes back to ketamine sort of being the Wild West. Friends and family members are facilitating ketamine sessions because IV ketamine is treated like dialysis and, chemotherapy in the vast majority of infusion clinics. And so, if you were able to find, as a master's level practitioner who had graduated, someone who was running an IV ketamine clinic, there would be no legal reason why you couldn't facilitate and sit for those sessions and work in psychedelic assisted therapy. Because ketamine's a Schedule III, it's being prescribed from somebody else. I would say you probably would want to contact your licensing board and get ahead of that and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And I think this is something that we all can do in terms of working with our licensing boards, as well as helping educate them and say, hey, this is something that I see. And the more emails that we get into them and those types of things, the more they're going to see that this is something that they need to pay attention to. In terms of having MAPS training, this is something that, Jenni, we're both frustrated about this. Like, the FDA stopped additional phase 3 sites from being implemented. And so we're both going to be up to the point where we can do our clinicals and MAPS training, but we don't have sites. And so this is one of the biggest problems in the field right now, is this bottleneck effect. MAPS wants to train 25,000 therapists by 2030. That's over half of the mental health counselors that's about half of the mental health counselors that are employed in the United States. It's an absurdly high number. And so the training and scaling here is a huge issue. And so I think too, in terms of sort of legal and ethical areas, our licensing boards are state level licensing boards. And so I don't know what it's going to look like in a place where, maybe these are decriminalized at a state level and somebody facilitates because, well, it's a state licensing board. Even though our code of ethics say that, we have to practice within the scope of the law, it never says whether we have to do that according to the federal law or the state law. It's ambiguous. And so you're getting at some of the real problems of this. And so in terms of, I don't know, training's expensive. And so, do you want to go out and shell out, the CPTR program, I think $10,000. MAPS, I think, is like $5,000. Polaris's is much more affordable. I think their 40-hour training is about $1,500, and it's ketamine specific. And so you've got to kind of think about, your positioning. Do you know somebody that might be able to plug you into a ketamine clinic? If you know somebody that is already working at like an MDMA site that's FDA approved, fantastic. But it is challenging to sort of get into the field in terms of actually facilitating sessions. In terms of the prep work and integration, I think that's a much more kind of gray area, and something that you kind of have to do your own sort of internal feeling about. What is my knowledge? What is my scope? What's my competency here? And then, you know, also researching your state laws in terms of, you know, what is actually there. For me in Ohio, there's a law called, I think it's, oh geez, I'm blanking on it now, but corrupting somebody with drugs is essentially the law. And so, you know, if push came to shove and I got, you know, bucked up against somebody that really pushed that, that might be a legal challenge that I would face. I really mused at Rick Doblin, he's the head of MAPS, his statement, Jenny, at our recent conference was that people don't file complaints to the boards because it goes poorly. Family members file complaints because it goes well and they don't like the changes that people are making. And so it's a really complex area in terms of how to get a foot in the door.
Yeah, let me if I could follow up on that. I was chair of the Virginia Licensure Board. I was also chair of the board for NBCC. So credentialing and ethics related to that is something that I got a lot of experience with. And from my experience with the Virginia board, and I served 2 terms on the board, I would urge a lot of caution. You know, it's part of our ethics that again, as Ben referred to, that you don't work in an area which you haven't had training and experience. And boards are going to interpret that very, very differently. Don't necessarily expect licensure boards to be enlightened in any way. And you know, at Ben's point, there's 51 different boards. And actually 52 if you count Puerto Rico, 52 different boards, and they interpret things and act very, very differently. So I like Ben's idea of getting in touch with the board and say, how do you guys feel about this? And they can't necessarily tell you until the complaint comes up. But you know, I would just be very wary, because again, 50 different boards, and yeah, the feds don't license people. That's a state activity. And so you've got these 50 different boards around the country that are going to be interpreting all this very, very differently. And just staying in touch with them, being aware of how they look at it is going to be a very important piece of this, I think, in terms of practice. Sorry, I butted in there, but.
Management perspective. Yeah, in addition to the boards, you have to consider whether your malpractice insurance will cover this. Because if you get a complaint and you lose in court and your insurance doesn't cover it, you literally can lose everything. And if the boards don't approve of this, you can lose your license too. So how much risk do you want to assume in offering this kind of treatment?
And so it's very different for me now that I've gone through this training and, you know, can say like, no, I actually have been through very specific and specialized training to be able to do integration work, to be able to do harm reduction work as sort of a preparatory. And so, yeah, I think as Jenny said, you know, figuring out sort of your own risk level and comfort is going to be important there. So anybody else kind of on this one here, or maybe move on to the next question? All right, Camila?
Yeah, I guess Jenny just sort of touched on this that I wanted to ask about. I'm in the Wild West of ketamine right now. Just completed a training through Field Trip Health. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. It was just their first pilot training in Seattle for ketamine assisted therapy. My background is actually in CBT and trauma focused CBT, but I've been, you know, researching. I just finished reading How to Change Your Mind. Found it fantastic and very helpful to just understand the research actually in psychedelics. And I'm actually in the process now of switching from working for an anxiety therapy facility to just being on my own and doing this CAP co-op. So I guess maybe some of you are familiar with that. So you provide ketamine assisted therapy to your clients, to your private clients through the facility, through Field Trip Health. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but I'll start doing that in January in Chicago. I guess I'm a little bit wary just about that, just licensing, and I've contacted my license provider, and I have not really gotten a straight answer from them. So I guess just in terms of liability, right? How do you? I know that I wouldn't be the Field Trip is responsible for providing my clients with ketamine. I'm just doing the I'm just there for the journey session and then the integration session afterwards, which is just done via telehealth. But how do you cover like liability? Is there like something that we can request or our licensure providers, not our licensure, I'm sorry, or malpractice providers to ensure that they cover that type of service?
Yeah, so one of the few malpractice providers that I'm aware of that provides specific write-ins for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is American Psychological Associates. And they will put that on there and you'll be covered. I would say in terms of, that's also a good question for Field Trip to ask them, because Field Trip is interesting. They're an enormous organization at this point, extremely well funded, and I think in probably half a dozen states and major cities. And they're also a little lax, I think, in my personal opinion. $700 and you go to them, you get your 30-minute assessment and you get a guided session, and then you get like 30 minutes of integration. And so I think they're maybe a little bit more lax than they might ought to be. And there are also many other companies that are entering the ketamine space that are doing at-home lozenges. So there's a company called Mind Bloom that will mail clients lozenges for at-home ketamine use. I spoke with somebody the other day who is building a company where I could pay them $200 a month, and they will provide medical intakes for clients that I have, prescribe them lozenges that they could come do in my office. And so ketamine is very interesting. And I expect we're going to see some folks be harmed because it's so lax, and there's so little regulations around it. There are a lot of folks who are very scared of what ketamine might do to the progress of the field because of how lax it is. So I would definitely say, speak with Field Trip about your concerns there and say, what liabilities do you have, or do I have? What protections can you offer? And I think some of that might also, I don't know, because you're entering in some degree of business relationship with them, whether you're paying them for access to their space or however it is. And so all of that's likely to pan out differently based on the nature of that business relationship and how it's constructed. So I think ketamine is a really interesting component, and I would say at minimum, what you would need to do is make sure that it's explicitly written into your malpractice insurance.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jenny or Rick, any questions on that? Okay. We've got like 10 minutes or so left here, and I'm okay maybe going a little bit over if folks want to hang out. But I want to maybe shift gears a little bit to, how can students maybe start approaching this in their master's program? And in terms of, whether that is, doing class projects on it, or like encouraging faculty to maybe explore research. If you're a really motivated master's student, maybe building up some, kind of research for yourself around some of these projects. I think, Rick, how would you maybe advise master's students to interface with their programs around this topic and start creating some buzz and addressing it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I'm seeing more and more master's students who are asking that question. And I think one thing to remember about counselor educators, Marty, you can chime in on this if you want, that the counselor educators are generally, perhaps I should say that counselor education is generally a few years behind what's on the cutting edge, because generally we don't teach it. And again, this is a gross generalization, unless it's in the textbooks. So in my experience, just over the last 3 or 4 years, I found surprisingly few counselor educators that really are well informed in terms of psychedelics. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that last year's American Counseling Association conference, there were 2 presentations there by me and Ben, and that's all you saw. So it hasn't been, I guess what I'm saying, it hasn't been a frequent topic of discussion in professional meetings or in professional training situations. I've seen very little of it. So the implication of that for a student is there's an excellent chance that an awful lot of your faculty members are not going to be well informed. And so I think if you want to start bringing it into the conversation, I think one thing to do is in an appropriate class is to talk with your faculty member about doing research on the topic. That you say with sort of this idea that I haven't done anything with this, but I've been hearing about it. This is one thing I would throw into the conversation. Say something about, I've been hearing some really interesting research coming out of places like Johns Hopkins and some of the other programs that are doing research on psilocybin. And I'm saying that specifically, just mention Johns Hopkins because that's going to give it a lot of credibility. I mean, it's sort of a shallow way to do it, but I think, just be aware that a lot of faculty members are going to be really, really new to this. And also, I think, really skeptical of this as a legitimate topic of conversation. So I would approach it from a research perspective, saying that you're interested in finding out more about it. You're seeing some really impressive research. And if you want to impress them, say, and the effect sizes are really large. Wouldn't be a bad thing to throw in there, because they are. And so approach it that way. Approach it from a research and a curiosity point of view. And maybe about 50% of the faculty members, that's just a rough guess, are going to show some interest in it too, if you approach it in the right way. But I think talking about in terms of research, in terms of the legitimacy of the topic as a research topic, and talking about that the research is showing really promising results, I think it's probably a good way to, sort of using those terms and using that perspective is a good way to do it. But do expect some skepticism from some faculty members. And and that this is where, if you use, I try to avoid the word psychedelic. That's gonna, for some people, that's really going to just get it. You're going to get a negative reaction.
Rick, I think you really hit the nail on the head. In fact, everything that you just described is essentially how I've been working it out through my master's levels class. I essentially, what I do is I just tie psychedelics into all the topics that I'm typically doing.
Yeah.
And everybody knows what I'm doing. And not only is the librarian, but a lot of the faculty, I've got little to no pushback at all at my at my grad school, and it's nice, But I usually try to take Dr. Carl Hart's kind of advice on this stuff is to stop being in the dark about this stuff. Stop being in the closet, because if people keep being in the closet about this whole thing, then there's going to be no mainstream access into this area. So I'm out and I'm proud. And in more ways than one. But I think that it's very important to take that research side of it and get other people involved. I mean, that's the reason why I constructed that Delirium Psychedelic Society in the first place.
That's great.
I'll say, I think too, increasingly you can link some of this to theories that you might be studying. I believe Yale did some work with acceptance and commitment therapy and psilocybin. And so there are a few studies that are using more well-established kind of theoretical orientations to approach the work. And so that could be another kind of link and pushover. So yeah, I think staying grounded in the literature and those types of things would be helpful. Joseph, you had a question there?
Yeah. I'm Joseph Garcia. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Williamsburg, and I'm actually teaching Rick Gressard's class, the transpersonal class at William & Mary right now. And what kind of sparks me jumping in, Rick or Ben, and like your mention of kind of being out, I think one of the reasons that I'm teaching the transpersonal class ultimately is because I spoke at a class that was being taught by Daniel Gutierrez, last year. And the conversation inevitably ended up on hallucinogens and hallucinogenic therapy and experiences and what that looks like. And personal experience has always been a really important piece of that for me. And I've always been it's always been very important to me to not just understand the map, but to have journeyed, having had experienced the territory itself. And I just kind of wonder, I guess I've always been very open about it, probably, I would say to my detriment, but it's ended up with me teaching a class and things like that. So I don't know that it's been a detriment, but, you know, actually it's funny. My wife was telling me earlier tonight when I told her that I was coming to this, she was like, well, don't talk too much about things. It's like, okay. She's like, you can be a loudmouth about this stuff. And I was like, okay, I'll try. But that's always been a part of the outreach for me, is like sharing these experiences and kind of demystifying, just kind of taking the fear out of it ultimately for people. And so most of my experiences, years of experience, has been non-therapeutic. It's been very haphazard and, you know, potentially dangerous, but, you know, it's always been a very positive. Even, you know, I tell people even the negative experiences I've had, particularly the negative experiences I've had, have been the most potent as far as like facilitating change in me and ultimately therapeutic growth, psychological growth. So I kind of wonder what everybody else's feeling is about being open about our own experiences with this, and being open with clients about our own experiences, and just in general, like as professionals in the field, like is it going to reflect negatively on our field if we're talking about ourselves doing these things, or is that a positive?
I can chime
Hello.
in here.
Oh, could I chime in?
Sure. I'll say just a reminder to folks, as we want to be respectful of people's time. If you want to hang out a little bit more, we can kind of work through this question. And if not, this video will be uploaded online. So if anybody needs to go, we'll make sure you have access. But if you want to go ahead, Michelle.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Tulik. I'm a student at Thomas Jefferson. It used to be Philadelphia University. I'm in the community and trauma counseling program, so it's a big focus on trauma. My interests are specifically intervention and prevention in the school setting. So, you know, public policy, teaching children mindfulness skills, but also I'm passionate about psychedelics when it comes to trauma. And I don't really have any faculty members here that are kind of aware of that. And I also struggle with like the language, because I know there's like a negative stigma around using that, you know, psychedelics and such things like that. And so I'm just kind of wondering how I can navigate that. I know we don't have that much time, but I kind of wanted to ask, like, where do I even start? I heard some of you guys saying kind of how to approach people, but I'm really, really want to just really be part of the community, and I don't really know how to, because I don't really have anyone around me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Michelle, if I can just offer you a little help on that. One of your faculty members is Catherine Sperandio.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, she's great.
She's one of my students.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, so she would be a great place to start. In fact,
Okay.
I think she took my transpersonal course.
Okay.
But she sure knows it in terms of working with me for actually, she got her both degrees for 5 years. So she would be a great place to start. Bring it up. She'll and tell her I told you to.
Okay, well.
She has to respond to that.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So you do have a link there. You do have a link there.
Okay,
It's not her primary
yeah,
interest, but she'll be
I
open.
never thought of linking up with her. She's my orientation of counseling professor, and it's just really lecture heavy. It's no research. I just never thought to reach out to her about that. So
Yep.
yeah, thank you.
You'll have a friend there. Yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, I think this is kind of a challenging piece, and then you know, the flip side of that, Joseph, too, is that you know, there are also people that are working in these spaces and are interested in them that haven't had experiences. And so this is something actually that I was able to collect some data on, and it's one of the areas that counselors are a little bit more wary of. We're hoping to publish this in JCD in the next few months. But in general, counselors are a little bit more wary of saying things like, personal use should be a part of training, or the idea that, personal use might enhance your ability to empathize or work with clients in some capacities. So I think there is a little bit more hesitancy there. And actually, an article came out pretty recently about actually credibility and psychedelic researchers disclosing their psychedelic experiences. If I can find it and remember to, I'll maybe include it in sort of a chime out email as we do this. But I think, in general, folks that appeared more psychedelic in nature, we're talking, like swirly colors on their backgrounds in church, they're perceived as less credible. And this is just kind of the nature, I think, of the scientific approach to this. There's some other good articles that talk about how psychedelics have been approached over time and objectified in some ways that are not necessarily helpful. But in terms of, I also had that question very early on of like, if I'm doing integration work, can I talk with clients about my own experiences and things like here? And in our training thus far, all of the videos we've seen of folks that are working with clients through this, they're open about it. They're not necessarily going to talk about like current or recent use. And I think folks that are a little bit further along in their career have a little bit more leeway to do that than folks that are just starting out. And so those would be things that I would take into consideration with that. And then I think too, in terms of like, from a risk perspective, if you're sharing your own experiences, then you're perhaps likely to be in a space where that discussion is more interpreted as, condoning use. And so that might get you in a little bit more legal trouble where, things to kind of.
I do pretty actively condone it. Yes.
And so, these all wind up being, personal decisions that folks have. I was working with a client today doing some integration work, and, I didn't talk about, the experience that I had 2 weeks ago. And so it's a comfort level. It's something that, you'll build out with different clients individually on your own. And I think, yeah, being able to point both to your own experiences and the research, I'd say walk both lines. Jenni or Rick, I don't know if either of you maybe had anything else to kind of throw in on that. And Michelle, same for you. If you're able to kind of ground your own experiences in some research and say, hey, I think some other things we can do here is change some of the language. If we say, I had some transformative experiences instead of mystical experiences, or
I use shamanic journey like that.
Yep. And so finding some different ways to frame it could also be helpful. Jenni or Rick, anything else to add?
I've always liked transformative. I mean, I think it's something that's very acceptable. It also sounds very counseling like. But I think, there's, and Matthew mentioned this in his note, that there's a matter of picking and choosing and getting a feel for where you can. And that's, I really relate to that, because that's what I've been doing for 50 years is picking and choosing who, and for me, being very careful. I mean, it's been a lifetime of doing that in academia. And I come from an era when even talking about meditation, if you talked about that, you're thrown out into the wacko part of counseling. So it's been a long process, but I think it's still a matter of picking and choosing and being sensitive to who's around you and how much you can really go into in your terms of your interests and experiences. I mean, I think we're still in a state where I think you've got to be careful. I just advise people to do that.
I think it's also important to ask yourself, what is my expectation, or what am I seeking from the program and the faculty? In my particular program, it was clear very early on that no one knew anything about psychedelics. And so they weren't going to be of any help to me in any way, shape, or form. And actually, my role within the program for the last 3 years has been one of education. I'm educating them on what the research is showing and why this is important and why they need to get up to speed on it. So maybe, your program itself isn't the place to go for help. Maybe, you need to be in groups like these. Maybe you need to take a MAPS training. Maybe you need to take the CIS training. to get the support and the information that you need. Because Rick made a very good point that, this stuff there isn't much of it in the literature right now. So your professors aren't going to be conversant in it. How do you be conversant in something that doesn't exist? So you may have to look outside your program.
Right. So thanks, Jenny. I think I would be all right with kind of closing there. This is an ongoing discussion and something that I'm hopeful to kind of chime back in and keep these conversations going with some of you all as we move forward into the future. Some things that we didn't get to do at the last ACA conference, was kind of get this network together and maybe meet in person. And so we hosted a social hour last year, but this would be something that we might like to do in person is, get people together at conferences and things like that. And I think that's really how these things really start to gain some traction. We'll keep, the interest group and network informed just in terms of, how our talks maybe with ACA about becoming an official interest network are going. I'll say, if anybody in here did not fill out the RSVP, if you would do that and just send us, put your email there, I'll send out just kind of a summary and maybe the link to this conversation that we've had today and any of the articles maybe that we alluded to here. And then I'll also attach to that, we're still needing a few folks to sign a petition for the ACA to endorse us as an interest network. I think we're maybe 5 or 6 folks away. And so if you can give us your email address, I'll send that back out to you all. And if you're a member of ACA, we'd really appreciate some of that support that you could give us. So with that being said, I think I'm in a spot where I can say thank you all for coming in tonight. And it's been a pleasure hearing everybody's experiences and where they're at. I hope today was informative. And if you have any leftover questions or anything like that, feel free to send us an email at psychedelic.counselor@gmail.com. And then some of you, I think, also have my other email address, but that's the Interest Network email address there. So Jenny and Rick, any closing thoughts here?
I just want to thank everyone. For me, this is just a really exciting discussion to have, and it's just so great to be able to talk with people, not have to pick and choose what you're saying in a group like this. And if you can't pick up the energy I'm feeling about it, then you're misreading me, because I think to me this has been like a great hour, and I thank you all for being a part of it. Again, as an old timer, it's been around a long time. This is just wonderful for me to experience and to see. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you all for your time. I echo everything that Rick said. I feel the same way.
Yeah. All right. And with that, we'll end it there. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a good night, and stay involved and stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Thanks.